The courtroom was colder than he expected, the kind of cold that seeped into his bones and made every sound sharper. He sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded tightly, the folder of evidence resting in front of him like a shield. Across the room, his brother looked composed, dressed in a pressed suit, his hair neatly combed. He carried himself with the same confidence he always had, the same air of responsibility that had fooled so many for so long. But beneath the surface, there was a tension in his jaw, a flicker in his eyes, as though he knew the mask was about to crack. The opening statements were measured, but the weight of them pressed against the air. His lawyer spoke of sabotage, of fire, of violence witnessed and recorded. Each word was deliberate, each phrase designed to strip away the illusion his brother had built. When the defense responded, it was with the same old story: concern for a troubled sibling, claims of exaggeration, the suggestion that the protagonist was unstable. The words were familiar, echoes of the lies that had haunted him for years. But this time they didn't land the same way. This time there was proof. The texts came first. Projected on the screen, the words glowed in the dim courtroom light. Threats disguised as jokes, warnings that now read like confessions. The jury leaned forward, their eyes narrowing as the messages scrolled past. His brother shifted in his seat, his composure slipping for the first time. The smirk that had once been his weapon faltered, replaced by something tighter, something closer to fear. Then came the financial records. Withdrawals that matched the nights of sabotage, receipts for accelerants, purchases that had no innocent explanation. The paper trail was clear, undeniable. His brother's lawyer tried to object, tried to spin it as coincidence, but the pattern was too precise. Each document was another crack in the facade, another piece of the mask falling away. The witnesses followed. Co-workers who had seen the assault, neighbors who had smelled the chemicals, strangers who had pulled his brother off him in the parking lot. Their voices were steady, their words unshakable. Each testimony added weight to the truth, building a wall too solid to be ignored. His brother sat rigid, his hands clenched, his eyes darting toward the jury as though searching for someone, anyone who still believed him. His parents were there, sitting in the gallery, their faces pale and drawn. For years, they had believed the lies, had looked at him with suspicion, had pulled away. Now, as the evidence piled higher, their expressions shifted. His mother's eyes filled with tears, his father's shoulders sagged. They looked at their elder son not with pride, but with something closer to horror. The truth was no longer hidden, no longer deniable. It was laid bare before them, and they could not look away. And when he took the stand, his voice trembled at first, but it did not break. He spoke of the rumors, the manipulation, the fire, the fists. He spoke of the silence that had nearly destroyed him, the isolation that had almost convinced him he was what his brother claimed. And then he spoke of survival, of gathering proof, of refusing to be erased. The courtroom was silent as he finished, the weight of his words hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. The defense tried to recover, tried to paint him as unstable, but the effort rang hollow. The jury had seen too much, heard too much. The mask his brother had worn for years was gone, shattered under the weight of evidence and testimony. What remained was not the image of responsibility, but the truth of cruelty, exposed and undeniable. When the verdict was read, the words seemed to echo through the room. Guilty. The sound was final, heavy, undeniable. His brother's face crumpled, the confidence gone, replaced by something raw and broken. His parents wept quietly, their hands clasped together, their world fractured by the truth they had refused to see. He sat still, his breath steady, his hands trembling only slightly. The fight was over, and for the first time, the truth had won. As he left the courtroom, the air outside felt different, lighter, sharper, filled with a clarity he had never known. The scars remained, the years of betrayal still etched into him, but the weight of silence was gone. His brother's cruelty had been exposed, his lies dismantled, his power stripped away. And though the family was fractured, though the wounds would never fully heal, he walked forward with the knowledge that he had survived, that he had spoken, that he had been believed. The truth was his now, and no one could take it from him again. The sentence was read in a voice that carried no emotion, but the words themselves were heavy enough to shake the air. Guilty on all counts. Arson. Assault. The gavel struck, and with it came the sound of something breaking. Not just the illusion his brother had worn for years, but the grip he had held over everyone who had believed him. The courtroom emptied slowly, voices hushed, but he remained seated for a moment longer, his hands pressed together, his breath steadying. He had waited so long for this, and now that it had come, it felt less like triumph and more like release. Outside, the sky was pale with morning light. He stepped into it with the weight of scars that would never fade, but also with a freedom he had never known. His body still ached from the blows, his mind still carried the smoke of the fire, but beneath it all was a clarity that steadied him. He was no longer the boy silenced by rumors, no longer the man nearly erased by violence. He was something else now, scarred, yes, but unbroken. The family fractured in the aftermath. Some relatives clung to his brother's memory, insisting the conviction was a mistake, that the system had failed. Others stayed silent, unwilling to choose, their absence louder than any words. A few reached out quietly, their voices tentative, offering support too late to mend what had been lost. He accepted their words without anger, but without need. He had learned that survival did not depend on their belief. It depended on his own. The move came quickly, a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood where no one knew his name. The rooms were bare at first, the walls blank, the air carrying the faint smell of fresh paint. He unpacked slowly, each box a reminder of what he had salvaged, of what had survived the fire and the years of betrayal. There wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to begin again. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the light turned golden, he opened a box he had saved for last. Inside was a single photograph, edges worn but unburned. It was of himself, younger, standing in a field, the sky wide above him. He held it carefully, his fingers tracing the outline of the boy he had been, the boy his brother had tried to erase. The image was simple, ordinary, but to him it was everything. Proof that he had existed, that he had endured, that he had not been destroyed. He found a nail, a hammer, and placed the photograph on the wall. The sound of the hammer striking echoed through the empty room, sharp and final. When he stepped back, the picture hung there, small against the blank expanse, but steady. It was the first thing he had chosen to put up, the first mark of himself in this new space. A declaration, quiet but unshakable. I'm still here. The room felt different after that. Warmer, fuller, as though the photograph had carried with it not just memory but presence. He sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, and let the silence settle around him. It was not the silence of isolation, not the silence his brother had imposed. It was the silence of peace, of a life no longer dictated by fear. He knew the scars would remain. The betrayal would always be part of him, the years of manipulation and violence etched into his memory. But he also knew that scars were not just reminders of pain, they were proof of survival. Each one was a mark of what he had endured, of what he had overcome. And in that knowledge, he found strength. The night deepened, the city quiet outside his window. He closed his eyes, the image of the photograph still vivid in his mind. His brother was gone, his lies dismantled, his power stripped away. What remained was the truth, and the truth was his to carry forward. And so the story closed, not with erasure, but with endurance. Not with silence, but with voice. He had walked through fire, through fists, through lies, and he had emerged scarred but free. The photograph on the wall was more than a keepsake, it was a symbol. His identity, though attacked, had never been erased. It had survived, and now so had he. My own brother spread lies to destroy me, tried to kill me with fire and fists, but the truth dragged him into court while I walked away scarred yet unbroken. He heard it first from a cousin at a family gathering, the words slipping out casually, like they were common knowledge. Something about him being reckless, about him drinking too much, about him not being able to hold down a job. He laughed it off at first, but the cousin's eyes didn't waver, and there was a weight behind the words that made his stomach turn. Later, when he asked where it had come from, the cousin shrugged and said, "Your brother told me." That was the moment the air shifted. The moment he realized the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. It wasn't just one rumor. It was a pattern, a slow drip of poison that seeped into every corner of his life. Friends started looking at him differently, their smiles tighter, their questions sharper. His aunt pulled him aside one evening and asked if he was doing okay, her tone heavy with suspicion. He hadn't done anything to warrant it, but the doubt was there, planted like a seed, watered by his brother's voice. He could feel it growing in the silence between conversations, in the way people hesitated before answering him. He tried to confront his brother once, late at night in the kitchen. The house was quiet, their parents asleep upstairs. He asked him straight out why he was saying those things. His brother didn't deny it. He just smirked, shrugged, and said, "People believe what they want to believe." The words landed like a slap, casual and cruel. He wanted to hit him, to shake him, to make him understand what he was doing, but instead he stood there, fists clenched, the refrigerator humming in the background, and realized his brother enjoyed watching him unravel. The worst part wasn't the lies themselves, but the way they stuck. Once a rumor takes hold, it doesn't matter what the truth is. People remember the story, not the correction. He found himself second-guessing everything he did, wondering if he was feeding into the image his brother had created. If he stayed out late, it was proof he was reckless. If he stayed home, it was proof he was unstable. Every choice was a trap, every action twisted into evidence against him. He started noticing the distance in his parents' eyes. His mother asked more questions than usual, her voice careful, as if she were tiptoeing around something fragile. His father grew quieter, watching him with a kind of wary detachment. They didn't accuse him outright, but their silence was worse. It was the silence of people who had already made up their minds. He wanted to scream, to tell them it wasn't true, but the words caught in his throat. He knew they wouldn't believe him. Nights became the hardest. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, he replayed conversations in his head, trying to find the moment when things had shifted. He thought about the times he had trusted his brother, the secrets he had shared, the loyalty he had given without question. Now, all of it felt like ammunition, like every word he had spoken in confidence had been twisted into a weapon. The betrayal wasn't just in the rumors, it was in the intimacy that had been turned against him. He tried to hold on to his friends, to explain, but explanations sounded weak, defensive. The more he insisted, the more they looked at him with pity, as if he were proving the very instability his brother had described. He could feel them slipping away, one by one, until the phone stopped ringing, until the invitations stopped coming. Loneliness settled over him like a heavy coat, and he wore it everywhere he went. Sometimes he wondered why his brother did it. Was it jealousy, spite, or just the thrill of control, the satisfaction of watching someone else's life bend under the weight of his words? He searched for reasons, but none of them mattered. The damage was already done. His brother had found a way to rewrite him, to turn him into a character in a story he hadn't chosen. And everyone else seemed content to believe it. He thought about leaving, about packing a bag and disappearing into another city where no one knew him, where his brother's voice couldn't reach. But the thought of running felt like surrender, like admitting the rumors were true. So he stayed, moving through the days with a quiet determination, even as the walls closed in. He told himself he would find a way to fight back, though he didn't yet know how. In the end, it wasn't anger that stayed with him, but a kind of hollow ache. The fracture wasn't just between him and his brother, it was between him and the world he thought he knew. Trust had been broken, and once broken, it couldn't be put back the same way. He carried that knowledge with him, heavy and unshakable, the first crack in a foundation that would never feel steady again. And though he didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning. He noticed it first, in the way his mother's eyes lingered on him, searching for something that wasn't there. She asked if he was sleeping enough, if he was eating properly, if he was taking care of himself. The questions were gentle, but they carried an edge, as though she expected him to crack open and spill proof of his own ruin. He told her he was fine, but the words seemed to slide past her, unconvincing. Later, he overheard her whispering to his father in the kitchen, her voice low, worried, as if she were talking about someone already lost. It didn't take long to trace the source. His brother had been busy, weaving a story out of scraps of truth and exaggeration. A missed class became evidence of irresponsibility. A night out with friends became a spiral into recklessness. A quiet evening alone was painted as withdrawal, a sign of something darker. Each detail was twisted, reshaped, and delivered with the authority of an older sibling who claimed to be concerned. Concern was the mask, but control was the motive. The father's silence was harder to bear than his mother's questions. He didn't accuse, didn't confront, but his eyes carried a new weight, a kind of watchfulness that felt like judgment. At dinner, he would glance up when the protagonist spoke, as though measuring his words against some unseen ledger. The conversations grew shorter, the laughter thinner. The warmth of the table, once steady, now flickered like a candle in a draught. He tried to defend himself, to explain that the mistakes were just that. Mistakes, not symptoms. But explanations sounded hollow when the narrative had already been written. His brother had planted the idea, and now every word he spoke seemed to confirm it. If he protested too much, it was denial. If he stayed quiet, it was proof of withdrawal. The trap was perfect, and he could feel it closing around him. Friends began to notice the shift too. His parents' unease seeped into the way others treated him, subtle but unmistakable. Invitations grew fewer, conversations shorter. He caught whispers when he entered a room, the kind of whispers that carried pity more than malice. He wanted to shout that it wasn't true, that he wasn't unraveling, but the more he tried to prove it, the more he felt like he was performing for an audience that had already decided the ending. At night, he replayed the small mistakes his brother had twisted. The forgotten chore, the late arrival, the careless word. None of them had seemed significant at the time, but now they loomed large, reframed as evidence of collapse. He felt himself shrinking under the weight of them, as though his life had been reduced to a case file, each misstep catalogued and presented as proof of his instability. The betrayal cut deeper because it came wrapped in the language of care. His brother spoke of him as though he were fragile, as though he needed protection from himself. To the parents, it sounded like love. To him, it was suffocation. He could see the satisfaction in his brother's eyes when their parents nodded gravely, when they looked at him with that mix of worry and disappointment. It wasn't love. It was victory. He began to withdraw, not because he was unstable, but because the constant scrutiny made every action unbearable. He felt watched in his own home, his words weighed, his silences dissected. The house that had once been a refuge now felt like a stage, and he was the unwilling actor in a play he hadn't agreed to perform. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier, and he longed for escape. Sometimes he wondered if his parents truly believed it, or if they simply found it easier to trust the older son's version of events. Trust was a habit, and habits are hard to break. He was the younger one, the one still finding his footing, and maybe it was easier to see him as the fragile one. The thought stung, but it explained the way they looked at him, the way they pulled back without ever saying why. The distance grew quietly, like a shadow lengthening at dusk. There was no single moment of rupture, no dramatic confrontation. Just a slow erosion, a steady pulling away, until he found himself alone in the very place that was supposed to hold him. And in that silence, he understood the depth of his brother's manipulation, not just the lies, but the way they had reshaped the family itself, leaving him stranded on the outside of his own life. He waited until the house was quiet before going to his brother's room. He had rehearsed the words in his head all day, trying to keep them steady, trying not to let the anger show. But when he opened the door and saw his brother sitting there, calm as ever, the words came out sharper than he intended. He asked him why. Why the lies? Why the whispers? Why the poison he had poured into their parents' ears? His brother didn't flinch. He just looked at him with that same smirk, the one that said he was already in control. The silence stretched, and then his brother stood. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he shoved past him, walked into his room, and began pulling things from the shelves. Books, clothes, the framed photograph of him and their mother at the beach. He hurled them to the floor, one after another, the sound of breaking glass sharp in the stillness of the night. The protagonist shouted, tried to stop him, but his brother's movements were wild, deliberate, as though each object destroyed was a message. The desk went next. Papers scattered, notebooks torn, the lamp knocked sideways and clattering to the ground. His brother's breathing grew heavier, his face twisted with something darker than anger. It wasn't just rage, it was satisfaction. He wanted to be seen like this, wanted the destruction to be witnessed. The protagonist stood frozen, torn between stopping him and realizing that this was the proof of everything he had feared. His brother didn't just want to ruin his reputation, he wanted to erase him. When the last of the books hit the floor, his brother turned, eyes blazing. "You think you can stand against me?" he said, his voice low, almost calm. "I'll finish what I started." The words hung in the air, heavier than the wreckage around them. They weren't shouted, but whispered with a certainty that made the room feel smaller, the walls closer. It wasn't a threat in the heat of the moment, it was a promise. The protagonist felt his chest tighten, his breath shallow. He had expected denial, maybe even guilt, but not this. Not the open admission, not the pleasure in it. His brother wasn't hiding anymore. He was showing his hand, revealing the cruelty that had always been there, just beneath the surface. And in that moment, the protagonist understood that this wasn't about mistakes or misunderstandings. It was about power. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His brother stepped closer, the smirk gone now, replaced by something colder. "You don't get it," he said. "They'll always believe me. No matter what you say, no matter what you do. You're already finished." The certainty in his voice was worse than the violence, worse than the broken glass at their feet. It was the sound of someone who had already won. The protagonist backed away, his hands trembling. He wanted to fight, to shout, to prove him wrong, but the weight of the moment pressed down on him. His belongings lay scattered, broken, and his brother stood over them like a victor surveying the battlefield. The destruction wasn't random, it was symbolic. Every torn page, every shattered frame was a piece of his life dismantled, a reminder that his brother could take from him whatever he wanted. The room smelled of dust and sweat, the air thick with tension. He thought of their parents asleep upstairs, unaware of the chaos unfolding beneath their roof. He thought of the rumors, the manipulation, the way their trust had already been stolen from him. And now this, violence, threats, the promise of more to come. It wasn't just betrayal, it was war. His brother finally stepped back, his breathing slowing, his eyes still locked on him. "Remember this," he said, his voice steady now. "You can't win." Then he turned and walked out, leaving the wreckage behind, leaving the protagonist standing in the ruins of his own room. The sound of his footsteps faded, but the words lingered, echoing in the silence. Alone, he sank to the floor, his hands brushing over the broken pieces of his life. The betrayal was complete, not just in the lies, not just in the manipulation, but in this moment of destruction. His brother had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And as he sat there, surrounded by the wreckage, he realized that the fight was no longer about defending himself. It was about survival. He noticed the change first in the way his phone stopped buzzing. Where there had once been messages, plans for late-night drives, quick jokes, the casual rhythm of friendship, there was now silence. Days passed without a word, then weeks. When he reached out, the replies came slow, clipped, polite, but distant. He told himself people were busy, that life had shifted, but deep down he knew it was something else. The silence wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, and it carried the shape of his brother's voice. At gatherings, the air felt different. Friends who once leaned in now leaned back, their eyes darting, their laughter forced. Conversations ended when he approached, or shifted into something shallow, safe. He caught the looks, quick glances exchanged, pity mixed with suspicion. He wanted to ask what they had heard, what stories had been told, but the words stuck in his throat. Asking would only confirm it, would make him look guilty of something he hadn't done. So he stayed quiet, and the quiet grew heavier. One night, he walked into a cafe where he used to meet a group of them. They were there, sitting at the corner table, their heads bent close together. He raised a hand, started toward them, but the conversation stopped. One of them gave a small wave, half-hearted, and the others looked away. He stood there for a moment, heat rising in his face, then turned and left. Outside, the air was cold, but it didn't clear the ache in his chest. He walked home with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, the sound of their laughter echoing behind him. The lies had done their work. His brother hadn't needed to shout them, hadn't needed to prove them. He had only needed to plant the seeds, and people had done the rest. Rumors grow best in silence, and his silence had been taken as proof. Every mistake he had ever made, every awkward moment, every stumble was now evidence. He could feel the weight of it pressing down, reshaping him in their eyes into someone he didn't recognize. At home, the distance was worse. His parents spoke to him with careful voices, as though he were fragile glass. They asked about his day, but their eyes slid away before he could answer. He felt like a stranger in his own house, a guest tolerated but not trusted. The warmth that had once filled the rooms was gone, replaced by a tension that clung to the walls. He ate meals in silence, listening to the scrape of forks, the hum of the refrigerator, the sound of his brother's easy laughter filling the spaces where his own voice no longer fit. He tried to fight it at first. He explained himself, defended his choices, insisted that the stories weren't true. But explanations sounded like excuses, and excuses sounded like guilt. The more he spoke, the less they believed. He saw it in their eyes, the way they nodded but didn't hear him, the way they smiled but didn't trust. His words had no weight anymore. His brother had stolen that from him, and without it, he was left with nothing but silence. The loneliness settled in slowly, like fog creeping across a field. At first he thought it might lift, that things might return to normal. But the days stretched on, and the fog thickened until he could no longer see the outlines of the life he had once known. He moved through the world like a ghost, present but unseen, his voice swallowed before it could reach anyone. The isolation wasn't just around him, it was inside him, filling the spaces where a connection had once lived. Sometimes he caught himself wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe he was unstable. Maybe he was reckless. Maybe he was the person his brother had described. The thought scared him, but it also explained the way people looked at him, the way they pulled away. Doubt seeped in, quiet and corrosive, until he wasn't sure what was true anymore. He hated his brother for planting the lies, but he hated himself more for letting them take root. Nights were the hardest. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence press in. He thought about calling someone, anyone, but the fear of rejection kept him still. He thought about leaving, about disappearing into another city where no one knew him, but the thought of starting over felt impossible. So he stayed, trapped in the same rooms, the same streets, the same silence. The world had grown smaller, and he was shrinking with it, and yet, beneath the weight of it all, a small ember of defiance remained. He didn't know how or when, but he knew he couldn't let his brother win. The isolation was crushing, but it was also clarifying. It showed him the depth of the betrayal, the cost of silence, the fragility of trust. And in that clarity, he felt the faint stirrings of something stronger than despair, a need to fight back, to reclaim the voice that had been stolen from him. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that might become hope. The night was damp, the kind of night where the air clung heavy and the roads shone slick under the streetlights. He slid into the driver's seat, the familiar smell of old upholstery wrapping around him. The engine coughed when he turned the key, but it caught, and he told himself it was nothing. He pulled out onto the road, the hum of the tires steady, the world quiet. Then, halfway down the hill, the steering wheel jerked in his hands. The car swerved hard to the right, tires screaming against the asphalt. His chest slammed against the seatbelt as he fought to keep control, the headlights of an oncoming truck flashing too close, too fast. The car skidded, fishtailed, and for a moment he thought it was over. He saw the ditch rushing up, the blur of trees, the smear of light. Somehow, by sheer force, he wrenched the wheel and the car lurched to a stop, half on the shoulder, half in the grass. His hands shook on the wheel, his breath ragged, the sound of his heart beat louder than the engine still sputtering beneath the hood. He sat there, frozen, staring at the road he had almost left forever. When he climbed out, the night was silent again, almost mocking. He crouched by the front tire, his fingers tracing the jagged edge of a bolt that had been loosened, not worn. The realization hit him like a second impact. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't a faulty part or a random failure. Someone had done this, and he didn't need to ask who. The next morning, his brother was at the breakfast table, calm, casual, sipping coffee like nothing had happened. Their parents chatted about the weather, about errands, about anything but the near death their younger son had faced. He sat across from him staring, waiting for some flicker of guilt, some crack in the mask. But his brother only smiled, slow and deliberate, as if daring him to speak. When he told his parents what had happened, they nodded, murmured about how dangerous the roads were at night, how lucky he was to be alive. His father said something about bad luck with that car, and his mother touched his hand, her eyes full of sympathy but not belief. They didn't see the loosened bolts, the deliberate hand behind it. They saw only coincidence, misfortune, the kind of thing that happens. His brother had already written the story for them, and they had accepted it. He wanted to shout, to drag them outside and show them the evidence, but he knew it wouldn't matter. They would shake their heads, tell him he was imagining things, tell him he was unstable. His brother had laid the groundwork too well. Every protest would sound like paranoia, every accusation like proof of the very instability he had been accused of. The trap was perfect, and he was caught in it. That night, lying awake, he replayed the moment on the hill. The wheel jerking, the headlights rushing toward him, the sickening certainty that he was about to die. He thought about how close it had been, how easily his life could have ended in a twisted wreck of metal and glass. And he thought about his brother, sitting at the table, smiling. The smile was worse than the sabotage. It was the smile of someone who knew he could get away with it. The isolation deepened. Friends who had already pulled away now looked at him with suspicion when he mentioned the car. "Maybe you were tired," one said. "Maybe you overcorrected," another offered. He stopped trying to explain. The more he spoke, the more he sounded like the person his brother had described. So he carried the truth alone, the weight of it pressing against his chest, heavier than the seatbelt that had saved him. He began to watch his brother more closely, studying the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he wove his lies into the fabric of their lives. He realized then that this wasn't just cruelty. It was strategy. His brother wasn't content to ruin his reputation. He wanted him gone. The rumors, the manipulation, the sabotage, they were all steps in the same direction. And if he didn't find a way to fight back, the next step might succeed. The fear stayed with him, but so did something else. A spark, faint but steady, born from the knowledge that he had survived. His brother had tried to erase him, and he was still here. The near-death had shaken him, but it had also clarified something he hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't going to stop on its own. If he wanted to live, if he wanted to reclaim his life, he would have to fight. And for the first time, he began to think about how. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against the walls of a small apartment and makes every sound sharper. He had been dozing on the couch, a book slipping from his hand, when the first scent reached him. Sharp, chemical, wrong. At first he thought it was a neighbor, maybe someone working late with paint or varnish. But then the smell thickened, acrid, unmistakable. His eyes snapped open, and the air itself seemed to hum with danger. He stumbled to the door, heart pounding. And when he pulled it open, the hallway was already hazed with smoke. The fire hadn't caught fully yet, but it was waiting. He saw the dark sheen on the floor, the glistening trail of liquid that led to his doorframe. Accelerant. His stomach turned cold even as the heat began to rise. He didn't need to guess who had done it. The pattern was too clear, the escalation too precise. His brother's shadow was in the flames that hadn't yet bloomed, in the silence of the stairwell, in the smell that clung to his skin. He grabbed his jacket, his wallet, the few things within reach, and bolted. The stairwell was narrow, the smoke curling upward, and every step felt like it might be his last. His lungs burned, his eyes watered, but he kept moving, driven by something deeper than fear. Survival. When he burst out into the night air, the coolness hit him like a wave, but it didn't wash away the terror. Behind him, the building groaned, the fire beginning to take hold. Neighbors spilled out onto the street, their voices sharp with panic. Someone shouted for water, someone else for the fire department. He stood apart, bent over, gasping, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold on to the jacket he had grabbed. He wanted to tell them, to point to the trail of accelerant, to scream his brother's name into the night. But he stayed silent, the words caught in his throat. He knew how it would sound. He knew what they already thought of him. When the firefighters arrived, they moved with practiced urgency, hoses uncoiling, boots pounding against the pavement. He watched them work, watched the flames hiss and retreat under the spray, watched the smoke billow into the night sky. And all the while, he felt the weight of the evidence inside, the accelerant, the deliberate hand behind it. Proof, finally, that this wasn't paranoia, that his brother's cruelty had crossed into something undeniable. But proof was fragile. He knew how easily it could be dismissed, how quickly it could be twisted. His brother had already painted him as unstable, reckless, dangerous to himself. What would they say now? That he had done it himself? That he had staged it for attention? The thought made his stomach twist. Even with evidence, the truth could be stolen. He sat on the curb, the night air cool against his sweat, and tried to steady his breathing. His belongings, his home, his small sanctuary, all of it was gone or ruined. The fire hadn't taken his life, but it had taken everything else. He felt stripped bare, exposed, as though the flames had burned away not just his possessions, but the fragile shell of safety he had built around himself. His brother's face rose in his mind, not in anger, but in triumph. He could see the smirk, the calm certainty, the satisfaction of knowing he had pushed him one step closer to the edge. The sabotage of the car had been a warning. This was the escalation. And the message was clear. Next time, there would be no escape. He clenched his fists, the tremor in his hands giving way to something harder, sharper. Fear was still there, but beneath it was resolve. The fire had been meant to erase him, to silence him once and for all. Instead, it had lit something inside him that he hadn't felt before. A refusal. A decision. He would not let his brother finish what he had started. As the last of the flames died and the firefighters packed their gear, he stood, unsteady but upright. The night smelled of smoke and chemicals, the acrid reminder of how close he had come. He turned away from the wreckage, his eyes burning not from the smoke, but from the clarity that had settled in. This was the breaking point. The line had been crossed. And now, for the first time, he knew he would fight back. not just to survive, but to end it. He left work late, the streetlights buzzing faintly above the empty lot. The night was cool, the kind of cool that usually steadied him, but tonight it carried a weight. He had just reached his car when he heard footsteps quicken behind him. Before he could turn, the first blow landed, sharp and sudden, knocking the air from his lungs. He stumbled forward, his hands scraping against the hood. And when he looked up, his brother was there, eyes wild, fists clenched, the rage he had always hidden now fully unmasked. The punches came fast, each one fueled by years of resentment, each one carrying the weight of a man who wanted to erase more than just his brother's presence. He tried to shield himself, arms raised, but the force drove him down to the pavement. His brother's voice cut through the night, raw and guttural. "I'll erase you from the family forever." The words were louder than the blows, louder than the sound of his own breath rattling in his chest. They weren't just threats. They were a declaration, a final attempt to make him vanish. The world blurred, the asphalt cold against his cheek, the taste of iron in his mouth. He thought, for a moment, that this was it, that the sabotage, the fire, all of it had led to this final act. His brother's shadow loomed over him, fists rising and falling, and he felt himself slipping, the edges of consciousness fraying. The night seemed to close in, the streetlights dimming, the sound of his brother's rage filling every corner. Then, voices, shouts cutting through the violence, sharp and urgent. Hands pulled at his brother, dragging him back, breaking the rhythm of the assault. He gasped for air, his chest heaving as strangers stepped between them. One man held his brother by the shoulders, another shouted for the police. His brother thrashed, spitting curses, his face twisted with fury, but the blows had stopped. The spell of violence had been broken by the presence of witnesses. He lay there, trembling, the world spinning around him. The pavement was rough beneath his palms, the night air sharp in his lungs. He could hear his brother still shouting, still promising to finish it, but the words no longer carried the same power. They were muffled now, drowned out by the voices of others, by the sound of sirens in the distance. For the first time, his brother's rage was not hidden, not disguised. It was exposed, undeniable, witnessed. When the police arrived, the scene was chaos. His brother was restrained, his voice hoarse from screaming, his body still straining against the hands that held him. The protagonist sat on the curb, blood on his lip, bruises already forming, his breath shallow but steady. He watched as his brother was pulled away, shouting even as the cuffs clicked shut. The words were the same, erase you, but now they sounded hollow, desperate, stripped of their power. Neighbors gathered, co-workers too, their faces pale with shock. Some offered him water, others a hand on his shoulder. He nodded, grateful but distant, his mind still caught in the echo of fists, the echo of words. He realized then that the violence had not just been an attack on his body. It had been the culmination of everything his brother had built, every lie, every manipulation, every attempt to erase him. And now, finally, it had been seen. The ride to the hospital was quiet, the sirens fading behind him. He stared out the window, the city lights blurring, his reflection pale in the glass. His body ached, but beneath the pain was something sharper, something steadier. The assault had nearly broken him, but it had also revealed the truth in a way nothing else could. His brother's mask was gone, torn away in front of witnesses, in front of the law. He thought of the years of silence, the rumors, the fire, the sabotage. All of it had been hidden, twisted, denied. But this was undeniable. The bruises on his skin, the witnesses' voices, the police reports. His brother had tried to erase him, but in doing so, he had erased himself. The truth was no longer his burden alone. It was out in the open, undeniable, unshakable. As he sat in the hospital bed later that night, the fluorescent lights humming above him, he felt the weight of exhaustion settle in. But beneath it, there was something else, a flicker of relief, a fragile sense of vindication. His brother's rage had nearly destroyed him, but it had also exposed him, and for the first time, he felt the possibility of an ending not just to the violence, but to the silence that had surrounded it. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had shifted. He was no longer alone. He began with the phone, scrolling through months of messages, each one a breadcrumb in the trail his brother had left behind. There were threats disguised as jokes, warnings hidden in casual remarks, and late-night texts that carried a venom too sharp to be mistaken for anything else. He screenshotted them all, saving them in a folder that grew heavier with each passing night. The words, once dismissed as paranoia, now became evidence, each line a fragment of the truth he had been trying to prove. From there, he turned to the records. Bank statements, receipts, transfers that didn't add up. He noticed withdrawals that coincided with the nights of sabotage, purchases of accelerants, tools, and supplies that his brother had no reason to own. He printed them out, spread them across the table, and traced the pattern with his finger. The paper smelled faintly of ink and toner, but to him it smelled like vindication. For the first time, the lies were not just in his head. They were on paper, undeniable. The testimonies came next, though they were harder to gather. He reached out to the people who had seen the assault outside his workplace, their voices still sharp with the memory of fists and rage. Some were hesitant, afraid of being dragged into the family's war, but others agreed, their words steady, their signatures firm. He collected their statements, each one a shield against the silence that had once left him defenseless. Neighbors, too, had seen things. A man across the hall remembered the smell of chemicals the night of the fire, the way the hallway reeked of accelerant before the flames took hold. Another recalled seeing his brother lurking near the building, his face half hidden in the shadows. Their words were small, fragments of a larger picture, but together they formed a mosaic of truth. He wrote it all down, careful, methodical, determined not to miss a single detail. The process consumed him. His apartment, what was left of it, became a war room. Papers stacked in uneven piles, photographs pinned to the wall, notes scribbled in the margins of receipts. He moved through the space like a man possessed, piecing together the story his brother had tried to erase. The evidence grew, and with it, a sense of power he hadn't felt in years. For once, he wasn't just surviving, he was preparing to fight. At night, he lay awake. The glow of the documents spread across the table, casting shadows on the walls. He thought about the years of silence, the rumors, the manipulation. He thought about the fire, the sabotage, the fists. And now, finally, he thought about justice. The word felt foreign, almost fragile, but it was there, hovering at the edge of his thoughts. He clung to it, even as doubt whispered that it might not be enough. His brother still moved through the world with confidence, still smiled at their parents, still carried himself like a man untouchable. But the protagonist knew better now. He had the texts, the records, the witnesses. He had proof that the mask was a lie. And though his brother's shadow still loomed, it no longer felt invincible. The evidence was a light, small but steady, cutting through the dark. There were moments of fear, moments when he wondered if gathering proof would provoke another attack, something worse than before. But the fear no longer paralyzed him. It sharpened him, made him careful, made him precise. He double-checked everything, kept copies in hidden places, shared files with people he trusted. If his brother tried again, the truth would not burn with the flames. It would survive. His parents remained distant, caught between the stories they had been told and the silence they had chosen. He didn't show them the evidence yet, not because he doubted it, but because he knew they weren't ready. The proof wasn't for them. It was for the court, for the law, for the world beyond the walls of their house. He had stopped trying to convince those who refused to see. Now he was preparing to show those who could not look away. And as the folder grew thicker, as the walls of his apartment filled with the fragments of truth, he felt something shift inside him. The isolation was still there, the scars still raw, but beneath them was a new foundation. He was no longer the boy silenced by rumors, no longer the man nearly erased by fire. He was the keeper of proof, the architect of his own defense, and soon he would bring it all into the light.